in this morning, we covered the U.S. policy on AI. In this afternoon, second session, we covered the EU's regulation framework on AI. So this is the third session of our global symposium. Let me introduce the presenter, Dr. Adam Parker from University of Chicago, and give a big hands for him. Anna Lee, a scholar from the top private university in Korea. The first discussant is Professor Choong-Sik. He is a professor in the Kyungsung University, located in Busan. And he and I is kind of a founding father of this, our Center for the Intelligent Society and Policy, 13 years ago. So since then, we developed our center. We did a lot of research on digital government, smart city, and big data and AI. Okay. Another my colleague is the Professor Hwang Sungsoo from Yeungnam University, located in the Daegu metro area. Okay. So I give the 30 minutes around for your presentation.
Thank you. So yes, I'm Adam Parker. I'm from the University of Chicago's Committee on International Relations. I'd like to thank Professor Kim and Dr. Chung for having me here, and for everyone else at CISP for all of the hard work that they've put into organizing this conference. Has been very stimulating. So I'm going to switch the topic a little bit today from governance frameworks to thinking about other actors in the space of AI and automation and how they shape how those technologies are adopted and the policies that accompany that adoption. And also I'm going to take us a bit into the history of automations. As you'll see from this picture here, one of my arguments is that this is not exactly the first time that we've been here. As societies, we've had similar conversations about technological change historically, and I think there's lots of parallels there that I would like to explore with you today. So the first question that I wanted to address is, why are unions even relevant to the conversation that we're having today about the use of AI kind of broadly, but also about the use of AI particularly in government and by governments? So first off, in many countries, the US, China, most of Europe, the unionization of public sector workers is actually dramatically higher than the unionization of workers in other parts of the economy. And so in particular, when we think about governments adopting AI and other automating technologies, I think these actors, these unions are going to be particularly important. As just a snapshot of these statistics, anywhere from kind of 4 to 6 times as many workers are sorry, not as many numbers, but density of unionization in public sector versus private sector. Additionally, there's been a long tradition of work recognizing unions as potentially significant sources of opposition to new technology. So that's generally the way that unions are understood, as sources of opposition to adopting new technologies, particularly labor-saving technologies. And this is not simply a historical fact. This has happened even in comparatively recent history. So in 2016, the dock workers in Rotterdam repeatedly shut down the container port there, which is the largest container port in Europe, over these automation concerns, and won at least some limited job guarantees over this process. And this has happened, as I will again show, in historical periods as well. But an important thing that my work demonstrates is that unions are not simply oppositional features of responses to AI and automation. They have been, in various ways, kind of acquiescent to these concerns. So I also have the example here of the name is a little bit misleading. The Culinary Workers Union doesn't just represent culinary workers, they represent workers in Las Vegas, all throughout the resort industries. And so they also had automation concerns during their negotiations in 2018, even approved a strike authorization, but never actually went on strike. And they never won any particularly strong concessions about AI and automation. And this is also, again, a historical feature. So this leads me to kind of the next question, which is, why do unions respond differently? Why do workers respond differently to automation and to AI in different contexts over time? And the argument that I put forward today is that union responses are determined in large part by the diversity of the occupations of the workers that they represent. So we can have on, kind of on the one hand, unions that are defined more occupationally in terms of, kind of having one specific type of work of the workers that they represent. And so, as I'll explain more later, I argue that these more homogenous unions, occupationally homogenous unions, are much more likely to respond to automation because all of their members see threatened automation in kind of the same way as a common threat to all of the members, as opposed to in more occupationally diverse unions, you tend to see automation inducing preference cleavages between workers. An example of this that comes to mind is in the US, the dock workers are fighting against automation, but they're unionized separately from the workers that pick up freight from the ports in trucks and then move them inland. And so those workers often would prefer that the ports be more automated because otherwise they spend a lot of time sitting in line waiting for the boats to be offloaded and they're not being paid for that time. But those workers are in different unions. And so, but if you were to imagine a situation in which, my work gets easier when your work gets automated, you can imagine that I would have a much stronger preference that your work be automated. And so when you consider the ways that workers are included in those different types of unions, you'll see different outcomes. So briefly, I'll go over my theory, a methodology by which I test this theory of case comparisons and process tracing from historical periods, which again will argue is parallels in many ways to the discussions that we have modern times about automation and AI. And then I'll go through those analyses in a discussion. So just to give you a brief example of some of the literature gap that I argue exists, we've seen a lot of studies in automation and AI looking at its effects on various things, so voting behaviors, immigration preferences, redistribution preferences, all of these types of things. But at least in the political science literature, I feel like this tends to presuppose that AI is adopted or automation is adopted in a particular way. But we actually don't have a lot of literature looking at how do different groups respond to automation, how do they try to shape it. It tends to be just, this has happened to you, what do you do now? But actually there is a lot of politics underlying how automation technologies are adopted. So in terms of thinking about the cleavages that these induce, I start from kind of the routine biotechnological change hypothesis to look at the ways that different technologies shape the task level of work that is done by different individuals. And then from there, kind of, as I've just discussed, look at the ways that automation hurts certain workers, especially those that are targeted for having their labor reduced. But it helps a lot of other workers potentially who are in the same kind of value chain, but not directly being occupied, or not directly being targeted by automation. Nicole Wu also has this really brilliant example where the workers weren't so upset about automation, new technologies being brought into their factories, because the factories needed to be air conditioned to accommodate the new technologies, which meant that they now got to work in air conditioned factories that didn't used to be air conditioned. So these are kind of ways that these can happen. And so we need, I argue, models of how these occupational cleavages affect the coalitional politics of how workers and others respond to technological change. And so again, you can broadly think of unions existing somewhere on the spectrum of occupational diversity from very low to very high diversity. So on the low end, in the US, we would call these craft unions. So those that kind of unite the same types of workers doing the same types of work, often using the same types of tools. And this tool use is quite relevant to how they respond. The building trades, as we would call them, are one of these very highly homogenous unions. So you have, drywall tapers unions, right? Like that specific of a construction task of, who tapes up the drywall. We can have unions that are that level, right? So carpet layers, drywall tapers, painters, bricklayers, all of these trades can be and are in the US separate from each other. And on the other hand, you have these more industrial unions that try to incorporate all of the workers in a given industry. So the US Steelworkers, the United Steelworkers is one example of this, but there are countless examples of industrial organized unions, which are therefore highly occupationally diverse. They include potentially all of the types of jobs, all the types of tools that are used in a given industry. And so we can think of then workers very kind of simplistically as being those who are either and specifically targeted by an automating technology, by AI, and those who are not, with those who are targeted obviously being much more interested in opposing that technology, and those who are not targeted being much more accommodating or disinterested. And so highly diverse unions, as a result, occupationally diverse unions will include both of these types of workers, which again, I argue will not seek to oppose automation because these member preferences are quite dissimilar. And if you want to lead a union in opposition to automation and you fail, then all of the workers that are going to be automated away are now out of the union, and you're only left with the people who never wanted you to oppose this technological change in the first place. So it's a very risky strategy if you're a leader of a diverse union. Whereas a perfectly homogeneous union, which obviously very few of these exist in practice, but as a kind of type, will be much more likely to have only those who are targeted in them, and therefore are much more likely to oppose automation because these preferences across their membership are much more consistent. And so in terms of testing these hypotheses, I want to propose a few different alternative explanations that are not mine that I need to kind of address. So one is that unions can't oppose automation. This is an argument that I see in some cases, right? Technological change is going to happen. Workers don't have any say in it. The management decides what happens, and the workers just have to accept it. As I'll show, I don't believe that is true. There's also the idea that opposition is driven by union strength. So if a union is strong enough, it will oppose automation. If it's weak, it won't oppose automation, but it's all about how strong they are is all that determines whether or not they respond. But this again kind of presupposes a fixed desire towards automation or AI in any given context, which I argue doesn't exist. In terms of motivational alternative explanations, again, this idea that unions always want to oppose automation and that they will either just do so all the time or do so whenever they're strong enough to, or that there's also the possibility for other outcomes that workers are not, or unions at least, are not motivated by the workers themselves, but potentially by the survival of the union itself, the survival of the firm that they work for, especially in a context of globalization. Opposing automation can be quite damaging to the firm. If it disappears, then so does your employment. And then this is kind of another idea about adverse leadership, that leadership can be kind of captured by the firms, and therefore the leadership determines what they do. The leadership is in the pocket of the firms and the people that they work with, and so you would see an alternative outcome in that regard. And so if we find cases of opposition to technological change, that would reject some of these alternative explanations. If we find cases of acquiescence, that would address others of these. And then in other cases, I have to introduce controls to the study design to deal with these alternative explanations. So in terms of the methodology, I select two cases, attempting to control for as many confounders as possible. But one of the problems that we run into in trying to deal with unions according to this theory is that strength, for example, is correlated to size of a union. The bigger a union is, the more power it has. Well, obviously, then also the industrial unions, in my case, are also going to tend to be bigger just by necessity. They have more potential workers to draw from. And so some of these confounding effects are correlated to my occupational homogeneity hypothesis. So I choose first crucial cases, so cases where the alternative explanations other than mine would predict an opposite result. And then I also try to employ a process tracing methodology where I demonstrate that this causal mechanism that I propose is actually present in the cases. So it's not just the outcomes that I predict, but also that they exist in the cases that I suggest for the reasons that I have hypothesized. They're not just kind of happenstance that the outcomes exist the same way. So in terms of how I selected unions, I wanted to focus particularly on strong unions that were facing automation. Again, this idea that if I see unions failing to oppose automation, it wouldn't be because they're not strong enough. So for that reason, I pick a time period where there are strong unions and also a variety of different types of unions in the same case. So the U.S. From 1950 to 1975 serves this purpose for me. It's the height of U.S. Union strength. And so I wanted also to choose unions that were quite diverse in terms of the outcome the IV. So the first is the AFL-CIO, which is a very large diverse it's a very large, very occupationally diverse confederation of unions, and the International Typographical Union, which barely exists anymore because the work that it does was automated away, facing automation as well. So to give you a very brief introduction to these unions, the AFL-CIO, an industrial union department, highly occupationally diverse, very strong, and so I argue that weakness of the union can't explain why they wouldn't oppose automation, because this was the time that they were very strong. I do primarily archival evidence for this case from the AFL-CIO archive in the University of Maryland that I've consulted. Also to supplement with some congressional testimony, records, reports, other similar things from the time period. The ITU Local 6 was a local of the International Typographical Union in New York City, highly homogeneous, so primarily typographers and compositors working on linotype machines. So that's what you can see there are these machines used to set type in newspapers back in the 1950s. But they were also facing opposition from television news. So again, to the idea that you might be thinking these workers would be constrained by outside competition, you would think, cause them not to oppose automation, because they'd be concerned, well, if our firms don't remain competitive with these outside competitors, then we'll lose our jobs. So we would rather have some of our jobs be automated than all of us to lose our jobs. And again, contemporary newspaper reporting on these sources is my primary source. As you might imagine, the newspapers like to write about themselves, and so they cover the stuff that the typographers are doing quite thoroughly. They're also very well placed because all of the journalists are working in the places that are being struck, so they know them very well. So there's just some historical background. So this period of the late 1950s, early 1960s was one that was referred to as automation hysteria in the United States. So this was a highly salient period of thinking about automation. They weren't talking about AI yet, but a lot of the same arguments apply then. Technologies that were developed during World War II were often developed into these technologies that became known as automation. So this is the time period in which the word automation is actually first introduced into the English language. A lot of interest by the public and by unions in these technologies. And just to give you an example, by 1963, the word automation had skyrocketed very, very dramatically. I think it was like 3 in every 100,000 words. That happened in a period of about 15 to 20 years. The word internet didn't reach that same level of interest for another like 20 years after the word internet was first introduced. So this period of time was an interest in automation, at least as intense as interest in the internet was when the internet was first developed. So to give you some context there. Also, this was a high period of interest by the unions. So in their own newspaper, by 1964, 1 in every 3 pages on average of their newspaper was talking about automation. So they were talking about automation constantly, all the time in this period. So it's highly salient. So this provides a bit of the causal mechanism for the first hypothesis that I will trace through this case. First, that members had to exhibit the divergent preferences that I hypothesize exist. Union leaders have to be aware of these divergent preferences. They have to feel constrained by them, and as a result, not to actively oppose automation. So I'll start with the bottom, because if it turns out that this union opposed automation, then that's kind of the end of the story for me. So I'll start at the end and show that they did not. They cautiously embraced automation. There's the union statements and policy goals were explicitly accommodating rather than oppositional. This was seemingly unanimous across the industrially organized unions of the AFL-CIO. So for example, the AFL-CIO president, George Meany, in 1956, saying explicitly labor welcomes these technological changes, explicitly talking about the ways that they would improve workers' lives. You can see this again, the US Congress in a report in 1955 said that not a single witness in this hearing raised a voice in opposition to automation, specifically referring to organized labor. And for what it's worth, all of the unions that were represented in these hearings were industrial unions. None of the craft unions were there. They were seeking primarily collective bargaining measures. So these were relatively accommodating. They wanted some protections for their workers, but nothing like the kinds of universal job guarantees that would be sought by other more occupationally homogenous unions. And in particular, while attrition seems like a strong policy ask, because what they're saying is, please, like, don't fire any of our workers, but if they retire or they die, then you don't have to replace them. But if you think about that from the perspective of a union, that essentially says you can allow our union to die over time, right? That if no new workers are hired in these jobs, then as a union, who are your new members going to be, right? You're just eventually going to disappear. So this is actually quite an accommodating stance, I would argue, by unions. But you can see other things there. Eventually, though, this gave way to very broad legislative remedies, which removed the burden for responding to these union demands entirely from the firms and moved it on to the federal government, which made it even more accommodating to these new technologies. And if any of this looks familiar to the types of policy proposals that people have mentioned today with response to AI, I think that's valid. You see things like universal basic income in all but name being proposed by a government commission in 1965, 66, some 60 years ago before we started talking about UBI here with respect to AI. So then I need to show you that members' preferences diverge and that union leaders were aware of this. And so I will do that now. So this is from a UAW CIO report in 1954. We'll use automation to bring health and happiness, security and leisure, and freedom, peace and freedom to mankind everywhere, right? This is very lofty language, but again, talking about the ways that people thought that AI might help them, or not AI, automation, but it would help them. Talking about eliminating unpleasant work, unpleasant jobs. So they were actually looking forward to this, that these kinds of boring, tedious jobs would be displaced. In fact, talking about turning blue-collar work into white-collar work, quite literally, here is the idea. Talking about automation removing routine and uninteresting work, removing human drudgery, also acknowledging, though, that it does remove certain jobs. And so while they were very sanguine about what technological change might do for them, what automation might do for workers, they were not completely looking at this through rose-colored glasses. They knew that there were bad things that would come from automation. And so it's not just the case that they didn't oppose automation because they didn't think there was anything wrong with it. They did know that there were problems, and particularly the elimination of what were called unskilled or semi-skilled jobs at that time. Specifically also older workers that would have a harder time retraining and adopting new technologies were recognized as being particularly at risk. And so then to show you that these divergent preferences constrained members, constrained union leaders, I want to show you that they were specifically rejecting opposition. It wasn't just that they didn't think about it, and it wasn't that they didn't think that they could. It was that they were actively choosing not to oppose automation despite the fact that they could do so. So Luddism is perhaps a movement that you all will be familiar with from the early Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom. This was an example that was specifically rejected, that this opposition to technological change, of breaking of machines, was not a worthwhile thing that they thought was worth doing, including this president of the OEIU saying there are no longer any Luddites in the union movement. They also had a possibility of doing this. And so the way that I want to demonstrate that automation was possible was the way that they responded to other earlier things that when they were trying to unionize, for example, the automobile industry. So in the Flint sit-down strike of 1936-37, the UAW actually occupied a plant in order to keep them from moving pieces of machinery out of the plant that was going to weaken their bargaining leverage. These workers were confronted by the Michigan National Guard and actually literally physically fought with the police who were sent by the courts to evict them. And in fact, the union leaders who were responsible for leading the UAW and the AFL-CIO, Walter Reuther was one of them. He was physically at this thing. So this idea of like physically confronting and opposing the actions of management was within the living memory and in fact the lived experience of many of the union leaders at this time. So I argue that it's not that they didn't know that they could and they didn't feel like it was possible. They were specifically rejecting opposition as something that they didn't want to engage in. So moving on to my next case, the ITU. Basically, this is the same causal mechanism, but kind of flipped. So convergent preferences pressure on union leaders to oppose automation and that result. So the ITU 6 was very militant in opposing opposition. There were strikes, slowdowns, used to gain jurisdiction over the new technologies, and once they had that jurisdiction, making it highly restrictive to use those technologies such that it made it essentially prohibitive economically for their firms to adopt these technologies. And they succeeded in forestalling meaningful automation in their industries for over 20 years. So TTS is a teletype setting. It was a way of setting newspapers by wire. In fact, if you've heard of the term newspaper wire services, this is where that came from. The wires were telegraphs of instructions for how to typeset these stories by machine. There were a wide number of strikes in 62 and 68 and 74, a sympathy strike in 65, slowdown strikes in 67 and 70, 73, 74. So you can see throughout this period, they're highly active. Basically, every time there's a new contract, there's a strike or a slowdown in order to make sure that the contract doesn't allow any automation. And this is quite explicit in the news coverage at the time that they don't want these new technologies adopted in their workforces. Basically, no one was able to do this economically except for the New York Times, which had a separate edition in the West Coast until 1974, which was finally when automation was brought to the newspaper industry. So finally, opposition was overcome then. And even how that happened was not because the unions acquiesced, but they were essentially beaten. Not physically, but almost. Also, I want to show you that these concerns centered on unemployment, not on other things. So in the contract negotiations of 1961, they said the loss of job opportunities and serious unemployment is the reason that they opposed the contract, which had just the briefest tiny amount of allowance for automation. They were vocal in voting that down. Members all had a common wage, so this wasn't a question of wages. And it wasn't a question of preserving the organization, because in 1974, when the agreement was finally made to allow automation, what it essentially said was exactly what I had mentioned before. No workers could be fired for any reason, literally any reason. There were workers still going into work 15 years later doing nothing, just drawing a check for showing up, but they literally had nothing to do. But it destroyed the ITU as an organization. Nothing else ever happened in that industry after that. Preferences were very convergent. Even mild concessions were defeated by dramatic margins. So any of these concessions that allowed automation, so you see these are kind of paired in years at the top. Every time there was a contract that even hinted at allowing any type of automation, it was first voted down and then passed under a very modest margin. Every contract that opposed automation was passed by 2/3 majorities or more. I also show, again, that this case demonstrates that the AFL-CIO could have opposed automation. This was not an unknown thing. President Kennedy himself specifically commented on this strike in New York City that shut down the newspapers for over a year. So they knew that this was a thing that they could do, they just didn't want to. And it also shows that these cleavages can be quite easy, because one of the things that actually happened was, even though the union is quite homogenous, there were still at this time some people who were setting type by hand. Not many, but some. And this almost created a cleavage between those workers over responding to technological change. It's just that because there were so few of them, the union was able to overcome this problem. And so I'll briefly conclude with kind of resummarizing. So I've showed kind of, I think I've shown how occupational cleavages are central to the politics of automation, and I think by extension to also AI today. This is a novel theory of occupational cleavages in coalitional politics. Demonstrated a way that I think can predict the ways that unions will respond to automation without having to kind of wait and see what they do. This is a very observable thing about unions, how occupationally diverse they are. And yeah, so demonstrated this in these two cases that we've just discussed. I think this is generalizable to really any union that's facing automation or AI. And these types of unions continue to exist today throughout different countries and also within countries. I think also, though, there's a limitation, which is that in order to explain resistance to automation and technological change, you do need to have the means and the opportunity to do this. So this is a theory about what unions kind of want to do, but not necessarily what they're able to do. So this is why kind of when I started talking about the strength of public unions, I think that's very relevant because today private sector unions are much more constrained. Even if they want to oppose automation or AI, they're often too weak to do so today as opposed to in the past. So it could be that a strength in numbers thing, or it could be a strategic position in the value change. And also this theory wouldn't necessarily travel particularly well to places where firms are able to coerce workers or where governments repress unions very strongly, because obviously then these unions won't have the same kind of ability to respond, and this theory doesn't specifically address means or opportunity. I also want to briefly conclude by thinking about lessons for public unions and governments. Again, I think there's a tendency to think of technological change, automation, AI as inevitable or somehow preordained, that these things are just going to happen and workers just have to live with them. But I think this theory and these empirics demonstrate that workers do have a lot of agency over this process, that they do have influence over it. They don't just sit there and do and accept whatever change happens to them. And so governments can't just assume that government workers are going to just acquiesce to whatever they decide to do, that workers are potentially going to respond to this. And so in places where governments face these more occupationally homogenous public employees unions, like in the United States, they should expect to see a lot more opposition to efforts to include AI and automation in their operations. In particular, in the U.S., there's very strong and very homogenous unions in terms of teachers. The public teachers are often unionized, and it's just teachers in these unions. Law enforcement officers as well, highly unionized and very homogenous. Also transportation workers. So we think about, do we want to have self-driving buses, right? Well, the workers who currently drive the buses are unionized many cases in the US and quite occupationally homogenous there. And so it's also important to remember, though, that government policies shape the organizational structures of unions. The ways that government policies allow workers to unionize, how they make them, how they allow them to unionize, these shape the ways that workers are unionized. Industrial unions in the US, for example, are relatively harder to do because of the kind of very low-level bargaining unit by bargaining unit organization that the US labor laws impose. And so where governments want to smooth the way to automation, they may want to think about adopting these laws that would actually encourage broader organization. I think there was a time where people thought, well, if we break up these unions into really small, occupationally homogenous groups, then they'll be very hard to coordinate. They won't be able to effectively oppose automation because we'll weaken them by keeping them from being so strong. And I think that my work has demonstrated that at least with respect to automation, that has not been particularly successful. That these smaller homogenous unions can still find strength in their homogeneity and can still oppose technological change quite effectively. So thank you all for your time and your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Adam Park, for your wonderful presentation on labor responses to automation. Okay, now it's time for the discussion. Professor Chung, you have 10 minutes around. Okay.
Okay. My name is Chung. I'm honored to have it. Okay. I'm honored to participate as a discussant in this topic. Okay, and it is very difficult to discuss the paper because this paper focusing the specific topic in the US, especially in the 50, 60 years ago in the United States in the union labor activity like that. Okay, and let me introduce myself. 30 years ago, I joined the academic side. I'm working the Citibank Korea 7 years. For the 7 years, I'm working the 4 years in the union activity. So at the time in the clerical level. After that, I'm promoted to the AS. AS means authorized signer and officer, I promote. So officer and manager cannot join the union member. only the clerical level joined the, so Citibank Korea, also a US company. So I have experience in the US company union activity. One more thing, this book, Labor and Monopoly Capital. This book published 1974. Yeah, and 1980s. At the time, I'm reading this book. Why? My undergraduate majoring is sociology. At the time, Korea academic side, especially in the sociology, this book is one of the bestseller and treated as a Bible. This book focused on the labor process, not the union, but that is the most important topic. One more thing, and my master degree is I got the MBA degree, and my majoring is management information system. So, and labor process focusing the BPR. BPR means business process re-engineering. After that BPR introduced to the government side. So, and here, I fully agree today's presentation and theory, methodology, everything. I fully agree. But one more thing, and insufficient is the public side. Why? Public side is totally different in the business side. So union is the same, no, different. In here, and teacher, and specific the craft union, yeah, fine. But in government side, we using the technology, not simple to the automated. We using the technology to the government reform tool. That is different. So, and nowadays, the automation definition drastically changed. This paper focusing the 1940s, 60s, 70s, at that time, all the newspaper headline is automation. Yeah, correct. That time, from the manual to the automation, using the computer, that's fine. But after that, nowadays, in the internet, no, not the internet. Information superhighway and the cloud, big data, and even AI. So technology is drastically changed. So automation definition also changed. Do you know the RPA? RPA means robot processing automation. And using the Excel, using the macro, using the code like that, and automated the tedious job, routine job, etc. So automation means former 50 years ago automation definition and current automation definition is still different. So in this paper, target and the methodology and theory is fine, but AI era, we have to change the automate concept. So I suggest and digital transformation nowadays. So digital transformation and digitization is not fine. So one is the definition of automation. And second is the environment. Why? Industrial level is the extraneous variable in the company survival is important. In the case study, US Steel, but we assume the automobile company. So many Japanese company, because of the Japanese company in the Ford, Chrysler, and the General Motors and the union cannot resist in the automation. Why? Company survival is dependent. So same. So one more thing, in the case 2, in the New York City newspaper case, same in the Korea. In 1990s, at that time, Korea, all the newspaper company and typo, and reporter using the script, using the paper, and send it to the company editing department editing after that, and locate to the character. So, and publish the paper. But using the internet, reporter directly to sending the script, after that, published in the internet version. So, typewriter and typo step, we have to change the job change programs to the guard, safety guard and bus driver like that. So all the employee to the career job change programs to the another job. In the case, in the Korean company, so many newspaper company union cannot resist. Why? The company survival depend on the automation like this. So in this paper, we have to concern the exogenous variable is the company competitiveness like that. However, in the public sector, it's totally different. Public sector not compete. Public sector do not concern the organization survival. In public sector is government, we call the government reform, and in the United States and the reinventing government like that. So in the case, the technology, including the automation, technology, information technology is one of the most powerful enabler. So that is our strategy. In the case, in the automation, the wording, we have to change it in the digital era. Yeah, thank you. One more thing. Sorry. I prepared the one sentence. In 1997, in the United States, Clinton administration, 1993, Bill Clinton inaugurated the Clinton administration in the first term, 4-year first term. After that, 1997, Clinton administration published the Access America, that book in the preface. At the time, Vice President Al Gore wrote that preface introduction. I read it. The idea of engineering through technology is critical. We didn't want to automate the old one process of government. Information technology was and is the great enabler for reinvention. It allowed us to rethink in fundamental way how people work and how we serve customers. So that is all the labor process and the electronic service delivery, and focusing just before I told the BPR, business process re-engineering. So we have to concern the automation more complex and wording and expand the meaning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chung. Professor Hwang, you have 10 minutes now.
Okay, thank you. My name is Hwang from Yeungnam. Testing. Hi, my name is Hwang from Yeungnam University. Thank you, Dr. Parker, for wonderful presentation and paper. And I've read so much with fun and learning. And also thanks for bringing me back to 20-some years ago when I moved to Pittsburgh for my graduate school. And it brings me rather cold and snowy memory of Pittsburgh. Taking first, when I arrived, I took first of the courses that I took was American Politics 101. Pittsburgh, yes, you know, it's such a strong union city. We learned about the union, bargaining, and all that. A long time history, but very still city, very fun paper. And in page 2, I'm just gonna read his main argument. contributes to the political economy literature on unions by highlighting an understudied source of a variation that impacts their behavior. So I think this is absolutely interesting and wonderful because now we are studying the sort of the political psychology, economic behavior, sort of the Nobel Economic Prize on sort of psychology, effect, behavior, all these kind of studies. And you are kind of talking about automation, fun history, but also I think that we're repeating the same behavior pattern of new technology, artificial intelligence, but the humans, we're kind of repeating same behavior, same attitude. And I think that this is absolutely very essence of a fine American study that I enjoyed very much. And also, this was a very good example for comparative case studies that I could use in my graduate courses. So that was very that was very impressive. So, having said that, I have not so much of sort of a critical discussion or recommendation, but more of kind of questions and comments for further discussion and further study. So first, I think there is kind of, you mentioned a little bit, the job security and in my own phrase, perceive the threat to job security is a sort of our next research topic for us because you have a phrase, meal ticket. In Korea, we have a phrase of rice bowl because rice is our main thing. So don't take my rice bowl, okay? So that's kind of Korean joke. So since I see your affiliation international Committee on International Relations, so you want to sort of do some comparative study on internationally. So I think especially in Korean public setting, public organizational setting, there is whether there is perceived a threat or not, it plays a vital key in this behavior of adopting new technology. So I think in some way, if you can add and expand or work with some of the researchers with us, one of us, to kind of measure and investigate perception of the union workers or public servants threat, that's kind of, I think, that good expansion. And second, just for your knowledge's sake, in Korean, there's no job security threat. And in terms of a public sector, because merit system. And in this e-government IT research area, there is some criticism that there is not much attention or study on return of investment because there is a lot of investment in public information systems such as artificial intelligence, but we don't see any downsizing of public organization and no efficiency increase and things like that. So public unions will actually like it because they add more convenience, but the reduced workload, but their job security is still there. So I think these kind of keyword on different contexts in different countries will kind of give you a next research agenda. And the last, I think this is my interest and tough thing to study, but kind of time dimension. I agree with your very convinced with your proposition and evidence of your study from the case study. But for example, this as we forecast the adoption of new technology such as artificial intelligence, how much of time duration are we talking about? strong union or homogeneous organization will have a strong opposition to the adoption of the new technology. But how long? The time of diffusion of IT adoption, time kind of the axis. Since you showcased this nice a graph on page 11 of this newspaper, the graph. So I think the sort of the time duration, looking at different cases, will be kind of another interesting to look at. That's so much for now for me. Thanks for a great article, and thanks for bringing me back to the Pittsburgh days.
Yeah, thank you all for these wonderful comments and questions. So I think there's a lot for me to think about, but kind of two things that seem to me is kind of organizing some of what the concerns that were raised is kind of in two buckets. So one is, how does automation in the time period that I studied really relate to like AI and automation as we see it today? To what extent are these continuations of similar trends, and to what extent are there discontinuities between these two? And similarly, to what extent are there similarities or discontinuities between the private sector unions that I explicitly studied in this paper and the public sector unions that might also be involved specifically in government? So I think in terms of continuities with the technologies over time is the concerns over job security do still seem to be quite consistent over time. That like I've been very struck as I've looked into the historical record at just how strong the concerns over job security are, and just how much they reflect a lot of what I see also being discussed today. One of the big discontinuities that I see that I think I would like to study more going forward is that the automating technologies of the past were largely confined to inside a given workplace. And so either if you worked in that workplace, you interacted with that technology, but if you weren't in that specific office or in that specific factory where the technology was being adopted, it was of really no concern to you. And I think a lot of AI and automating technologies today are breaking that, kind of breaking out of a confined workplace and are existing kind of in very public and general public occupied spaces. So for example, I'm thinking about self-driving trucks, right? Like, if there was an automating robot adopted in your auto plant in Detroit, you don't care. Like, unless you work in that factory, you don't see the robot. You just get the car that it made, and you probably don't care that your car was made by a robot or by a person. It just, it's your car. A self-driving truck, on the other hand, shares the road with you, right? So if you're a member of the general public, the truck driver cares about whether the truck is self-driving because it's the truck that they drive in. But if you're the general public and you have to share the highway with the self-driving semi-truck, you care a lot about whether or not that technology exists, because now it's where you are, right? I mean, you can almost imagine the ad that the truck drivers union would run, right? Of like, I feel like everyone's had this experience of driving past a large truck on the highway, and you have to pull on next to them, and you just kind of start gripping the wheel a little bit tighter because the truck's so big and so close to you. And then just imagine looking up into the window and seeing nobody there, right? Like, you just look up into the window and there's no truck driver. You're just there next to this large truck that could like run you off the road at any minute. And so I feel like that's a way in which the technologies of today are quite different. And also in government service delivery, these are technologies that people really care about. When they were adopting computers to count the census, the average person didn't care that much, right? Because it was just the census it was counting, it was over there. But when you're talking about this algorithm that decides whether or not I get welfare benefits or my tax assessment on my property taxes, like, these things affect people in a more direct way. And so I think one thing that you didn't see in the past that I think you might see more of in the future is alliances between workers and consumers to address technological change, where again, consumers didn't necessarily care that much in the past about automation. I think today they care quite a bit more about at least certain automating technologies and AI. So I think you will see some of that. With respect to the differences between public and private unions, Yeah, this is a thing where I need to do much more comparative work, in part because public sector unions vary so differently across different countries in terms of what they're allowed to do, how they're allowed to operate. You know, can they strike? Can they give political donations? What are they allowed to do? That differs so much in different contexts. And also, as you mentioned, public sector workers potentially have much greater job security. And so I think there, you know, the way that I've presented this theory focuses a lot more on job security as the kind of impetus for why workers might want to oppose a given technology. But I think there are also ways in which technologies just change the nature of work that can make it either more enjoyable, less enjoyable, more tedious, less tedious. And so I think depending on how workers perceive those changes to technology, those can still be you know, impetuses for opposing a technological change, even if you're not worried about I'm going to lose my job, but I'm going to lose the job that I had. It's going to be different. It might be less meaningful. It might be, you know, I might not have as much judgment as I used to have. Now I have to do whatever the machine tells me. And so you see patterns of that in history where workers feel more or less autonomy. I think as Braverman calls it, kind of alienation from work, right? The ways that machines can kind of alienate workers from their work. That as these technologies change, you see different cycles of this where, you know, in the 50s, workers were saying like, oh, technological change will make my work better. You know, 30 years before that, mechanization was going to make my job worse. And so it's all these kind of give and take. But yeah, that's definitely something to think about as well. And also, you know, if we take my argument seriously and project it into the future, the ways that unions respond to automation can also shape unions in the long term, right? So like the ITU, when it was facing mechanization, was an industrially organized union. And then the technological changes kind of fractured the union into these different groups that then were craft unions later. And so you can imagine if you're a member of a homogenous or of a big diverse union that's not going to protect your job from automation, like, well, why am I a part of this union, right? Like technology is threatening my job and my union isn't doing anything about it. Maybe I should break off and form my own union that's actually going to do something about this. So it's another element of the time dimension that you mentioned, is that over time, this variable can change. So this is a kind of a short to medium term theory in that regard. But yeah, so I think there are still many continuities between the ways that people think about automation. And I guess the last thing that I'll say too is the role that unions and other organizations like them play in shaping workers' perceptions. So many times what I was seeing is that unions are involved, at least in this historical period, in educating their members about what technological change is going to do to them. The workers themselves don't necessarily know, but they've got a union that's researching and finding out what's coming and telling them what's going to happen. And so I think that's another role that certainly in the private sector in the US is now missing, that there aren't these kinds of trusted sources of information about what technologies are coming and what they're going to do to workers. And so workers don't necessarily have good information that they can trust about what's happening. And so you see some of this paradoxical things where people say like, yes, absolutely, the type of work that I do can be automated in the next 5 years, but my job won't be automated. Like my individual job won't be automated, even though I think that the type of work that I do can be automated. Like it doesn't make sense, but we see this in public opinion surveys all the time, that people have these very kind of paradoxical opinions about what technology means for their jobs. And I think some of that could be explained by the absence of these kind of trusted information sources, which I think is another role that unions play that isn't as prevalent today.
Any comments or questions? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dr. Parker, for the very good presentation on the labor union and the AI adoption. So I believe you suggested the very firm theoretical foundation when you think of the labor union and AI adoption cases. So for the question I have, I wanted to start with the news I heard the last year. So the last year there was a news on the Writers Guild of America. They demonstrated more than 5 months. Because they fear of the AI adoption in their field, in the filmmaking and writings. I think this is a good signal to see this the workers are this adoption of AI is not only for the automation of the routine work, and at the same time they may see this as a as an automation of the creative work. That meaning that they are expanding the target group that is impacted by the AI adoption by borrowing the concept of automations. So in my humble assumption, it may impact the categorization we have in terms of the occupational capabilities, like occupation divers. This meaning that, so if we adopt the theoretical framework of this presentation, so we may see this will impact the labor union in the average companies, not like the institutional the labor union, such as the labor union that is consists of lots of the different departments and a lot of the department labor types within the organizations. They may feel fear of the AI adoption because of it. They may lose their job, even they are not working the department of the routine jobs. So they are the fear of this type of the AI adoption. So in that case, I would like to hear your insight on what are the concerns we should have when we are adopting this one, especially in the adoption of AI in the labor union in the current era, and at the same time, what are the expected changes we should have in these adoptions? Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I think this is partly why, so in my work, I don't strictly adopt the routine technological change hypothesis, because I think there are many examples where work has been automated that hasn't been particularly routine intensive, and particularly that is increasingly the case today. I think there's a lot of, as you mentioned, creative work that's potentially being automated, or at least done by technology. We can argue about the definition of automation, but that being done by technology. And so that's another area, though. I mean, I think it's a tendency to say that this is something new about AI that we haven't seen before, that creative work is being automated and that wasn't seen before. And I think that that's true, but the discourse around automating change historically, I think, has always said, this is new, this is unprecedented, right? The typographical workers, today it seems obvious that they would be automated, but they were like, we're high skill work, no one can do this work by machine, like no machine will ever replace me, until eventually it did happen. And so again, you see the same kind of pattern where like the exact work that's being automated changes, but the ways that humans respond to it still is like, oh, well, it can't happen to me until it does. And so I think that is an important aspect of thinking and paying attention to who is being threatened by automation over time. But I think that the dynamics are still quite similar, the way that workers respond. The one thing that you said, the way that I understood what you said was that workers might want to support other workers who are being threatened by automation because they're concerned that if automation gets a toehold in the industry, then they'll come for me next, right? So like, I have to protect, my coworker and their job, not because I'm directly threatened, but because if they replace my coworker, then they'll replace me next. And so I need to kind of work in that way. And I think that makes a lot of sense that workers would think that way. I just historically haven't seen a lot of evidence that they actually do. So I don't know why they don't, because it would seem kind of rational that you would say like, well, I have to engage in this kind of solidarity. But historically, yeah, what I've seen is that workers tend to be like, well, that's their problem. My work is secure because, and I think maybe it's partly because workers underestimate the degree to which they can be automated. So they don't, see the threat that is, that their coworkers being automated presents. The other thing that I saw in the ITU case was also that other unions often, because of jurisdictional disputes, will support the adoption of a new technology that they think they'll get to control. So especially when workers are organized in these separate unions, you would see, for example, the photo engravers, which is a separate union at the time, thought, well, we'll control the new lithographic printing techniques. So yeah, bring it on. We'll get no more members. And so again, you might think like, well, they should have thought, well, if they can automate the typographers, they can automate us next, which is exactly what happened. Photographic printing techniques were used to further automate. Until now, there really are no people, as you mentioned, in the printing industry at all. It just goes from the reporter to the printer, and that's the end of the story. But they weren't that foresighted to think that like we'll be next. So I don't know why workers don't seem to do that, but at least in the history that I've studied, I haven't seen much evidence of workers behaving in that way, that like we should protect each other because once it happens to them, it'll happen to me next. But yeah, I wish I had a better explanation for why that happens.
I have two questions. I do not know whether you are placed to answer them, but I'm just not because I challenge your ability, but perhaps it's like another field. Which jobs are the most at risk for automation? From a trade union, but I assume that, for example, legal jobs will be very easily taken over by chatbots, automated AI tools. It's already happening, so I think I'm not sure at risk yet. And then the second question is there no positive impact? Because we talk about losing jobs, but of course AI technology will also create new jobs. I assume, right? Prompt engineers, for example, just one example, labelers, data interpreters. So should we not focus on the more positive elements than the negative ones? I don't know if these questions don't make sense, but
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of jobs most at risk of automation, I mean, there's a number of kind of frameworks that are used to think about this. Partly because I'm working in kind of a historical comparative frame, I try to stay away from the question of who's most at risk of automation, just because that changes consistently over time. So the routine bias technological change hypothesis is kind of the leading way of thinking about that these days, that the more routine your work is, the more kind of algorithmically it can be defined, the more susceptible it is to automation. But part of the problem with that is that routinization is often part of automation. My work becomes more routinized in order to automate it. So if you think, for example, again, historically, the first automobiles were made by teams of professional craftsmen who all knew how to make the whole car, right? It might be like 10 of them, but all of them knew kind of the whole process step by step. Well, what Ford did was to separate that process out to be, now instead of having to know how to build a whole car, all you need to know is how to like put a rivet in this spot or how to screw this door on. And that's kind of all that you need to know about the process. So the level of routineness of an occupation, I think, is also susceptible to change over time, that it's not just a fixed attribute of work, that you can make almost anything more routine if you really want to. So that's one way of thinking about it. There's also different ways of kind of conceptualizing types of skills that workers have, where historically more kind of social and emotional skills have been seen as harder to automate, more safe from AI and automation, things like customer service. But again, with the chatbots, you see the at least attempts to kind of outsource a lot of customer service. I'm curious to see how well that will go. I don't know how well consumers will accept chatbots as mediators of their customer experience, but maybe. Yeah.
I have my own prediction.
Yeah. And so for my own work, I try to stay away from making a strong answer about who is most susceptible to AI and automation, but I think there are different frames that people have used to think about that question. And then in terms of positive impacts, yeah, I mean, so that's actually one of the things that I tried to address in the paper, is that often the assumption of work that looks at how labor thinks about automation focuses only on the negative, of saying like, well, your jobs go away, therefore you're mad about it and you'll fight. That's kind of, one of the kind of priors that I encountered from a lot of people when I would talk about my work is, well, of course, unions are always going to oppose automation. Why would they not? It eliminates jobs. And so, yeah, I think there are lots of positive impacts of automation potentially to workers that they are aware of, and that's why certain workers are happy about automation, even in their own jobs, but certainly in the jobs of others. I think about medical imaging is another area where people are talking about AI might take over, where the interpretation of X-rays and MRIs and these kinds of things will be done by computer. And I think in that case, certainly the doctors who do that work might be upset. But if you rely on the timely delivery of medical imaging interpretation to diagnose your patients, you'd love to have that work automated so it just gets to you faster and you can do your job more efficiently. So definitely there are positive impacts to automation for different workers. But I think to the extent that workers are explicitly replaced by a given technology, those specific workers who are replaced are only going to focus on that, as opposed to the other workers that are near them, though very much might be happy to have their coworkers automated if it makes their job better in some way.
Thank you for your insightful and informative case studies about
labor's response to automation in the United States. So I'm wondering not only the labor's response to the automation, but also capitalist response to the automation. Considering the fact that the labor's response to something is very active to the capitalist movement and capitalist pushes on something. So I believe that is capitalist response to automation maybe would be a highly possible factor to determine the labor's response to the automation. So please let us know the capitalist response to the automation regarding these cases. Secondly, I was wondering the position or characteristics of the two unions in your case study. So AFC, as far as I know, AFL-CIO is an overarching or federation of the shop level unions, maybe, but ITU, I don't know exactly, but seems to be a shop level union of the laborers. So in that case, those kinds of the position and characteristics of the union may have another factors to determine the response of labor's response to the automation. I believe that there's a kind of possible third variable to explain the two different kinds of the reaction to the automation of the laborers. So please let me know the kinds of the possibilities of the third variable. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of the response of capital to automation, I think one of the ways that I see automation being used in capital is essentially there are, I think, broadly kind of two ways that capital has often thought about automation. One is just in terms of labor costs, right? They just want to lower labor costs, and if automation allows them to produce a product with fewer labor hours, then they'll accept it. In that frame, though, they often have multiple options for doing that. So this is kind of where my work also intersects with globalization, is that you can think of capital, if what they want is lower labor costs, they have kind of three broad ways of doing that. They either can bring cheaper labor to them. So this would be immigration. Historically, capital was quite in favor of free immigration, especially into the United States, to bring lower cost labor in and then employ that labor at lower costs. That would be one way. Outsourcing in the modern era of globalization is kind of, you don't have to bring the labor to you, you bring the capital to the labor, and then you just trade it back to your home country because tariffs are low and international shipping costs are comparatively low. And automation is the third way of doing that. And so one of the things that I see as well is that in that context of globalization, sometimes capital is quite resistant to automation in the sense that, or maybe not so much capital, but management, right? Because they also have their own work processes and their own understanding of how they manage their job, the kind of work that they do. And automation is often quite disruptive to management as well in terms of like how they do their job. And so there are even cases, the textile union in the US, for example, joined together with the government to try to find ways to make textile manufacturing more automated. The textile workers union wanted more automation of the textile industry because they were afraid the alternative was the textile industries were just going to move abroad, which is of course what happened. So there are no real textile manufacturers left in the United States. And so in that case, actually capital was not necessarily opposed to automation exactly, but they were reluctant to do it when they could just move to a source of cheaper labor. So I think that's one way that capital has responded. The other is with respect to kind of labor control. That sometimes what capital is trying to do is not so much reduce labor costs, but is to make labor more controllable. So often this is why they want to routinize work, make it more supervisable, more kind of legible to management, because your discretion, the workers don't have very much discretion, management has all the discretion, and so they can kind of see what workers are doing and enforce things on them. And that's another way that that they have tried to make this technological change in favor of capital. But one of the problems that they run into there is that once you kind of change the work in some ways, you often just kind of relocate who has the control in terms of workers. So let's say, for example, you're worried about your assembly line workers going on strike and shutting down your assembly line. So now you put robots in. But now someone has to maintain those robots and like make sure that they keep running. And probably there are fewer of those workers than there were on your assembly lines. So now the assembly line workers are gone, they can't strike. But there were more of them and it was harder for them to organize. Now you've got maybe a handful of robot technicians who can still shut down your plant. And now there are fewer of them and they're easier to get together to do what they want to do. So there's this push and pull where management often, capital is trying to gain control over labor, but often technological solutions aren't effective over the long term for doing that. They just kind of move around who has leverage among workers, but there's always some group of workers that has some kind of leverage, unless you manage to create a fully automated factory, which I don't think anyone has quite pulled off yet. Somebody always has to be there to do something. In terms of your question about the characteristics of unions, yeah, so this is the biggest pushback I often get on this methodological decision I made, is that the AFL-CIO is this massive confederation of unions, and the ITU, I'm talking about a very specific local within just one city, and so how could I possibly compare these two unions? And it's a fair criticism. But one of the reasons that I looked at the AFL-CIO in their archives is that I was able to see not just the AFL-CIO as a confederation and what it was doing, but what its individual industrial unions were doing as well. So within that, you saw some of the comments from the Teamsters, from the longshoremen, from different industrial unions. And really there were no industrial unions, even below the confederation level, that were really involved in significant opposition to automation in the time period that I studied. But in terms of future work, I think it would be good to look at kind of the higher level of the ITU, so not just its local in New York, but like kind of the organization as a broader institution and how they responded to automation. But yeah, that is a concern with this methodology, that the two unions are at such vastly different levels that maybe that's why they are behaving the way that they are. It's just that I didn't see any evidence of the industrial unions really at any level engaging in opposition, but I was looking at a fairly high level.
I want to have a quick comment on the job change that Jen brought, and because I think that Dr. Parker, you talked about perceived interest and unions' role of education, power of education changing, perception of workers and all that. I think that's really I think we're onto something, because I didn't read it in the paper, but your comment answering some of the question, I think that's something answering those our job change questions and all that. If we, I always bring this example of radiology doctors, MDs, since advanced, progression of the CT, MRI, all these technologies, would the doctors go away? No. The minority doctors will gain more control, more power, more income, and all that. And the legal tech, the same thing. A very starting lawyers, they have suffered, but the top lawyers will gain much more power, much more money. So it's all same thing for what this new technology. So I think the for us, this perceived threat versus perceived interest, this dimension is really powerfully explaining all these kind of controversies and things like that. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Adam, for the excellent presentation and the really careful work that you did on this project. I have two questions. The first one pertains to the potential for automation-related shocks to impact the member composition or just the composition of unions. So this is the idea that, which actually may be more applicable today than it is in the past, when there was high level of union participation in the past. But might there be a process by which individuals select into union membership because of fears of automation? So sort of like these considerations around automation driving preferences, which then drives selection into unions, which then drives the composition of preferences represented by the union? That's the first question that I want to hear your thoughts about. The second pertains to public sector unions, as we've all been talking about. And you may know many more examples than I do, but the ones that we're most familiar with from the public sector side, and the ones that you mentioned, include teachers, police officers. These are already highly homogeneous groups, right? So is this dimension of variation that you explore in this study something that is still analogous to variation in public sector unions? If not, are there other related potential dimensions that we might think are highly salient to the behavior of public sector unions with regards to automation?
Thank you. Yes. So on the question of automation shocks and union membership, this is definitely a thing that unions kind of expect, especially in white collar work. So this is kind of separate work that's not in this paper, but one of the big stories in the US is the failure of unions to really organize professional white collar workers. There are such unions in Europe, especially in Germany, but the US, white collar salaried workers are almost exclusively not unionized unless they're public sector workers. That's really the only place where white collar workers are unionized. And so there was a thought that when automation came to the office, as it had come to the factory, that this experience of kind of being subject to what they called machine discipline, computer discipline, would cause workers to flee to the unions into the open arms of the unions. And that didn't really happen, at least not in the US. And I think part of this is explained by the ways that workers think about their jobs. So there's historically been a cultural division between blue collar and white collar workers with respect to how they think about management in particular. White collar workers often kind of see themselves as like managers in waiting. And so they think with kind of management in mind, whereas blue collar workers don't tend to have that same kind of attitude towards their jobs. Again, I'm speaking in broad generalities here, but the other problem too that is that unions have to be equipped to speak to the problems of workers that are becoming under threat by automation. And particularly with regards to white collar work, I think American unions really failed, particularly on gender dimensions, to understand the workers that they were facing, that might have wanted help, but the unions weren't particularly well positioned to understand the concerns that those workers had. So a lot of American workers' unions were blue collar workers. George Meany had come out of, I think it was the cigar makers union. Walter Reuther was from the UAW, he'd come out of the auto industry. And they had this very kind of specific, very male, very blue collar idea of how workers thought about themselves and their work. And they just didn't do a very good job of understanding what white collar workers wanted and how they wanted to be represented. And so that, I think there is some interest in, well, as automation and AI comes to different types of work, will that drive workers to organize? I think there is an impetus that will happen. Like there is at least the opportunity for such things to happen. But I think you also, from the union perspective, unions need to actively prepare themselves to understand those workers and their concerns, that doesn't just happen. That kind of historically, at least again in the US, we've seen that white collar workers haven't been well unionized. And I think part of that is on the unions themselves for not having kind of positioned themselves to understand and articulate the concerns of different types of workers. So yes, I think if you are a pro-union person, there is hope in that regard that as AI comes to new types of work, you'll see kind of a revitalization of unionization, and I think you are seeing that to some extent. But I think for that to fully materialize, unions really need to step up and find ways to articulate the concerns of different types of workers in ways that they haven't always succeeded at in the past. And your second question, so what I understood is that many of the public sector unions in the US are already quite homogenous. So are there more like heterogeneous unions within the public sector to kind of think about? Is that?
Or are there other related dimensions along which you might expect varied responses from?
Yeah, so I think, so that's one of them. I think there's also, again, questions not so much just of job threat, but of like job quality. That, I think, law enforcement in particular might be more willing to accept certain AI technologies because it, might kind of give them almost outs to say like, well, I stopped this person because the algorithm told me to, but police officers are quite job secure, at least in the US. It's very hard to fire a police officer, even for cause. And this is in a country where you can fire anybody without cause most of the time. In the US, you don't really need a justification. Yeah, as a result of the strong unions in the law enforcement. I think more broadly, thinking not just about job security, but job quality is another kind of important element of how workers think about automation. And to the extent that AI or automation can make the jobs of various workers better, you're likely to see them adopt it, especially if they're not so concerned about job security. And I think also the more involved workers are in shaping the technologies that are adopted in the workplaces, the more likely they are to accept them. So you see in Germany, for example, auto workers are much more kind of involved in how management makes decisions about technology. And that has resulted, broadly speaking, in workers being much more accepting of technological change because they've had a voice at the table, whereas in many other contexts, they haven't had that same kind of voice.
It's about to close our third session. I checked the time at 5:27 p.m., but in the Central Time Zone, Chicago area, it's 3 o'clock past, 27 in the morning. So a little bit tired. We a little bit tired. So quick, short comments.
Okay, simply I explain the current situation in my personal experience. 1984, I graduated the university. My first job is NCR. You know the NCR? NCR is National Cash Register. Over the 100 company located in the Dayton, Ohio. So NCR focusing the CDN ATM. So 2 years working NCR. After that, 2 years working Deloitte Consulting. And third job is Citibank. Citibank at that time, my boss ordered to me, your first job is NCR. Worldwide, all the Citibank branch using the ATM NCR product. So you develop the ATM, 24-hour banking. So I developed the ATM, using the ATM, Korea, 24-hour banking. In New York, city never sleep. Bank, 24-hour banking. But at the time, public side, 9 to 5. Yeah. After that, I changed my career path in the public side. My majoring is electronic government. Electronic government comes from the electronic banking. So I'm a frontier and pioneer. Nowadays, last year in Korea, over the 1,000 bank branch was closed. And so many ATM also disappeared. Why? Because of this. Using this, I can buy the US dollar and even the European currency within 1 minute. I play this. So, 1 second. So, this is not the automation. It's beyond the automation. Drastically changed in the government side. I developed the government portal. Nowadays, government 24 in Korea. So using that portal and 24-hour public service also. Before the kiosk. So many, former name is Dongsamuso. Currently in the local district office also closed in Korea. In the same situation in the US, 20 years ago, you using the Walmart like that, but Amazon, now even the Chinese Temu like that. We call the electronic commerce, but nowadays drastically change in the click, click, click. So, but in the future, AI era is not coming. So in the now I'm touching, but later now and the older the voice and etc. So information technology is beyond the automation and drastically change everything, whole change. That's the point.
Thank you, Professor Chung. Yeah. It's really the time for ending the third session. Thank you, everybody. Our last session will resume in tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at the same room, this conference room. So we closed today's long journey for our global symposium. Thank you. See you tomorrow morning. Okay.